1 in a million to one villain. Too hot to be in the kitchen, I'll end up melting the ceiling.
What's going on, Hobby Lobby? It's your boy Javier Javier with the Javier Javier Show. Make sure you say it twice. I am here with the one and only Dallas Duff. What's up,
Hey,
Dallas?
how much, man? How you doing?
Good, I'm good, man. Can't complain. So we had a discussion, and I felt like it was a good thing to discuss on camera, get it out to the people. So we were discussing whether or not Jesus was a socialist. Now, uh, I would take the argument that Jesus is kind of on that line of being a socialist without having that title because it didn't exist at the time. Um, you would argue that Jesus was not a socialist.
That is correct. I wouldn't argue he was a capitalist either, though. That some people might make that argument, go, Jesus wasn't a socialist, therefore he must have been a capitalist. No, I would argue that Jesus never advocated for any particular form of government or economic system. So he's not a capitalist. He was about higher pursuits. His message was about morality and salvation and all these things. He talked about how you should treat people and all these things. But there are no references to any particular systems that he's advocating for. So that's first off, that's the bedrock basis, and I can expound upon that a lot more in more specifics that he said. Yeah, that's where I would start, at least.
Well, let's take it from this angle. Yes, you are correct to say Jesus never spoke about any economic systems based on government and how to reallocate resources. Specifically, I guess that's due to the time he was living in. I'm pretty sure that people wasn't talking about capitalism and socialism in the terms that we would talk about today. But if you took Jesus' philosophy and how he behaves and how he act towards other people, and you took somebody like that and put them at the helm of the government, uh, what kind of policies would you then get on the economic scale? How would you see that turning out?
So first off, I was trying to go through some of the specific parables and passages that are at least attributed to Jesus. I want to say this, that anybody who's on here looking to criticize specifics of Christianity or whether or not Jesus was even a real figure, let's all put those things aside, because I'm skeptical on some things and certain elements of Christian doctrine and theology, so I want to put that on the table as well. But just purely from kind of an objectivist perspective, when I say objectivist, I mean objective. I'm not talking about like the Ayn Randian kind of objectivist, just for those who are looking to jump on that as well. But I wanted to kind of look through some of the things that he is credited to have said, and from everything I can tell, if I could attribute any label to Jesus in this sense, he would be very much for voluntarism, which is very much not in the model of communism or socialism or any of these types of systems, these top-down systems. And I'll give a couple examples. Excuse me. So in Luke 12, and I wrote some of these notes down, so I make sure I'm not misquoting anything or getting the general gist of my point wrong. So in Luke 12, Jesus is confronted by a man that wants him to redistribute wealth. And he says, "Master," the man says to Jesus, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And here was Jesus's reply. He said, "Who made me a judge or divider over you?" And then he says, "Be on the lookout for all kinds of greed. Life does not exist in abundance of possessions." And then he goes on to make what I think is actually an interesting, nuanced point, because his point isn't necessarily to take the side of the rich man or the man with the stuff or the man wanting the stuff, because he actually goes on to criticize both. So he's obviously in that particular verse, he's criticizing the man who was wanting a cut of the stuff, of the money and the stuff. But then he also goes on to criticize the man who hoards all the stuff. And he makes the point to do not store up too many possessions here on earth. So he's simultaneously rebuking kind of both men, and I think that's kind of an interesting point. So it's really going back to another kind of primary theme on behalf here in this discussion. He's primarily about kind of higher pursuits, moral pursuits, and all these things. So he doesn't like to get in the midst of these types of disputes, especially as it relates to kind of worldly things. Like he basically rebukes anybody who's focused on the pursuit of worldly things. So, like I said, he's going to the man that wants the stuff, and he's like, "You shouldn't be focusing on all this stuff." And then he's going to the guy that has all the stuff, and he's saying, "You shouldn't be focusing on hoarding all the stuff." So, I think it's a very interesting, nuanced point that is being made there. And so, I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on that, but I'll throw it back to you.
I think that what we have to do here is cherry pick the Bible to find the Jesus that we want him to be. I could easily make statements like Jesus said that those who take care of the least amongst you, Jesus spoke a lot about taking care of the least amongst you. That could be translated into a socialist economic system. It could be those who has a duty, even if it's a moral duty, to take care of the least amongst you. Jesus also said, "Take no care for tomorrow." Basically, focus on today. And uh, Jesus was very much about helping the common man and helping those people in need. So I don't see how anybody taking that philosophy about Jesus running a government wouldn't feel compelled to, for one, capitalism focuses on the future. Capitalism focuses on long-term gains and profitability. Socialism focuses on to each one of to their needs, looking out for the needs of the people. I'm not defending socialism here, but what I'm saying is that capitalism is the direct contradictory to how Jesus spoke about, caring for the future and, worldly riches and envy and all of those things. I think Jesus would be very much against those ideologies altogether. I would even be tempted to say Jesus would be more of a socialist than a capitalist if you put it on a spectrum. I think Jesus would fall more closely on the socialist end.
Okay, so I obviously totally disagree, and I think the specifics of what he says actually is a total rebuke of that, because, like I said, in terms of what the critiques that you're throwing out there, they're all, I think, morally viable, but when we can kind of get into specifics of kind of some other things that Jesus specifically said, that would maybe more give kind of an insight into what kind of system he would ideally want society to have. It's definitely a much more voluntary system. And I'll give another parable example. So there's the parable of the vineyard. So the parable of the vineyard is essentially, to sum it up, so you have a landowner. He hires some laborers to pick some grapes, and near the end of the day, he hires more workers to get the job done. So in order to recruit them, he offers them a full day's wage for just 1 hour of work. And then one of the laborers who was hired to work the full day and paid the same wage, he starts complaining and says that, this is unfair. And then the landowner replies, "I paid you the amount you agreed upon." And then he added, do I not have the right to do what I want with my own money?" So this is obviously obviously a reference to the value of both property rights and voluntary contracts. And again, that's an absolute refutation of the idea that there should be any kind of like top-down model from like the government on up. It should be more about individual to individual, those types of things.
Well, I mean, I think you raise a good point, but I think that's still up for interpretation because I could take that same parable and point out the fact that the government is made up of we the people, and not everyone who actually wants a job or wants to work a specific job wants the pay that is being offered. Now, I agree that when you agree to a certain set of pay, then that's your voluntary choice to do so. But if the people decide in a country that they want to live a certain way by the means of the government, because it was also Jesus who said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and what is unto God to God. And if Caesar, being the government, requires that we redistribute wealth, I would think that would also fall in line with what Jesus said about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So the people of the government and the people decided that they wanted a socialist economic system, then we would be compelled, especially Christians, would be compelled to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
First off, I don't think they had. I don't know enough details about all of the specifics of their governmental structures back then, but I'm pretty sure
It
that
was
they
about
didn't have.
taxes. It was
They
about
Yeah, well,
taxes.
yeah, yeah, but yeah, my point. I'm pretty sure they didn't have anything that much resembled the type of democracy that most people today, when they're talking about whether you're a pure socialist or or you're kind of more one of these Norwegian socialists. And again, that's not a discuss. That's a totally separate discussion to have another time. But the systems I think that they had then were not those types of systems that I think most people. And again, I try and steel man the opposition as much as possible. I don't. I think that. I think and this is getting more into interpretation. So there's certain things that are maybe a little bit more concrete, and certain things that are up for interpretation. So my interpretation of kind of that particular verse that you're referencing is kind of really more along the lines of, I think it's more of a reference to the idea of separating kind of the church and
Church and
state,
state.
the government from kind of the moral and the religious and all these things. I think that thing, and this is kind of just my opinion, because it is what, like I said, what is vague and what is clear. I try and make those distinctions there. So I am admitting that there is a vagary to here, but that's more of my understanding, especially when you take it in context of kind of all the other verses that can be referenced that kind of point to more specifics that aren't as vague.
Well, I mean, if you want to play that game as far as like, well, the system they had set up then is not the same as the system we have now. But even if we kind of just separated the whole economic situation and let's say render on to Caesar what is Caesar's, and you wanted to interpret that as separation from church and state, then Christians or people who believe in the ways of Christ or follow Christ would be put in a box then, because we could make that same argument about abortion. Why are you trying to force your religious ideals onto the government about subjects like abortion, for example? Then you would have to take the back seat and say, you know what, that's Caesar. We have to allow the government to do what the government does and keep our religious views outside of the government. Wouldn't you also have to apply that same standard?
Well, I don't want to get too much in the rabbit hole of abortion, but I'll make one kind of quick comment on that. Is that the general conservative view of abortion is not necessarily that I need to thwart my own moral ideals onto everybody else. It's more around the question of, as a society, what do we agree upon are the things that are absolute right and wrong, and things we actually should protect. And the conservative view is that certainly at some point, like could be some vague arguments that can be made about really really early on in terms of the process. I'll even throw the other side a bone there and say, and there is a stage really early on in that development where the morality of what you're doing in the act of abortion might be somewhat morally vague. I don't think it does become morally vague at a point to where that there's a clear development of functioning human working parts. Like, I mean, I do think kind of the heartbeat thing is a pretty good indicator that what we're dealing with is a human being in that sense. So then the question becomes, do we as a society believe in protecting the innocent human beings in terms of their lives, and not allowing them to be killed. That's the you can disagree with that argument. You can make
But
opposing arguments. That's fine.
you're making you're
That
making a
that at
point
least,
that it's not a religious
I,
argument. You're saying that it's not a
yeah.
religious argument, that it's a more of a
Well,
scientific argument about when
I
a
mean,
fetus
it's
becomes a life, right?
I mean, yes, it's that it's a little bit of both, like, but it's only both in the sense that, like, is that one of the reasons why we believe in seriously protecting human life as opposed to how we treat other, like, quote unquote animals, is the primary basis of that is relatively religious in nature. I mean, the bedrock of that is the idea that human beings are somehow morally superior, or somehow of a higher type of being, and
Yeah.
it's hard to make that argument too clearly without at least somewhat injecting some kind of theological basis to the argument.
Well, I'm pretty sure someone can make the argument without religious um bedrock to lay it upon. But I would say that just there are multiple examples of conservatives or Christian conservatives using religious arguments to push certain policies or into the government, like prayer in school, for example, was a big thing that the Christian right had a problem with. And I'm just tying this back to you using an argument that render unto Caesar didn't mean taxes, it meant separation of church and state, which
No, it means both. Yeah, it certainly meant taxes, in the sense that, that in order to have any, I think we probably, whether you, me, and every other person on the face of the earth, with the exception of a few, really crazy kind of anarchists, would agree that, like, in order to have some kind of functional society, you need to have some kind of system of taxes. Like, whether you're a conservative, everyone everywhere from conservative to communist, agrees on that, and then
yeah.
turn matter from libertarian to communist. Even, most libertarians, as minimal, as little government as they want, even then most of them would agree. It's like, we got to pay some taxes. Like, there's some things that the state does need to do. So I
So
mean,
if Jesus was in head of taxes in America today, do you not think that Jesus wouldn't spend those taxes on feeding the poor, on taking care of the least amongst us? You don't think Jesus would have taken a socialistic perspective on how to spend tax dollars?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't want to be too speculative. I'm trying to focus on what I can see as concrete, and kind of what is stated, or at least is attributed to Jesus, and kind of the things that he said. So I mean, it's an interesting question. It's something that's an interesting question to ponder. I haven't pondered that specific question in too much depth. So I try not to talk too much out of my ass in terms of, like, just speculating on questions without giving them a whole lot of thought. So I mean, I don't know. That
Well,
is something.
let's deal with something concrete. Jesus was the same one who broke bread with everyone. Jesus was the one who took a few fish and a few loaves of bread and fed multitudes of people. This seems like a redistribution of what you could translate it over to wealth, but it seems like a redistribution of resources that
Well, the,
Jesus
well,
himself was involved with.
well, no, because it's more of an example of voluntarism than it is anything. I mean, it's like, somebody offered up the bread. Jesus was the one that did the miracles to multiply the bread. He consented to that, and to give out the bread. I mean, I'm not saying that's the best argument on my side, but I mean, it's definitely not an argument for redistribute. Well, whose bread are you redistributing? That would really be the question. Like, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to ask whose bread are you redistributing, I mean, well, just like the Bible, I know many Christians will make the argument that you can't just pull one specific thing out of the Bible and take it out of context. I hear that a lot, even no matter how much context you give a certain thing, they fall back on that when backed into a corner. But Jesus, if we put another concrete example from the Bible, Jesus was the one that told the guy to sell everything and follow me. He wanted him to give up all his worldly riches, all his worldly wealth to follow him. And
Right, but he had to do that voluntarily, right? Because I think that point again, this is kind of somewhat, and this could a little bit lead into, if we're going to get into a little bit of more kind of the general atheist views and some of the roads that can go down. It's it's a focus on away from kind of the pursuit and the clinging to materialism and material things. So he's asking the guys that he's saying, essentially saying the deeper philosophical point and moral point is that, look, like here's a situation where I'm more about kind of the higher pursuits, and you're clearly all invested in your stuff, and I'm asking you to I'm not saying someone should come in and take it from you. Like, I'm asking you to focus on the higher pursuits and not focus so much on the stuff. Can you do that? And it's the ultimate test of that. If you ask somebody to completely give it all up, if that's even possible. So,
well, what would you think Jesus would say to the politicians and the president and all of these people who are the lawmakers? You would not think that Jesus would give the same advice. Stop hoarding all this wealth. Stop, using your resources as a way of, acquiring worldly things. Shouldn't you be
well,
helping the least amongst you? Shouldn't you be going and helping the poor and the people in need? I think Jesus would make this argument. I'm pretty sure that you could see that, right?
well, first, government, certainly our government, no government that I've ever even been aware of hoards wealth. They spend wealth into debt. That's so you could argue that Nancy Pelosi, or really any of them, I mean, most of them are rich, right? Like, so you could argue that a lot of those individuals are hoarding wealth to some extent, and therefore should maybe be a little bit more generous with what they do with it as individuals. But what's the government? Is the government hoarding our wealth? No, the government is spending our wealth, and they're spending it so much that we're $27 trillion into debt. So
So I guess it all comes down to, I was assuming that Jesus will be the one who wants to use the resources to feed the least amongst us and to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was when I was naked, did you clothe me? Or all of these things that Jesus said. It just seems like if Jesus ran the government, I think that we would see something akin or at least close to a socialistic society. And I'm willing to lay my hat on that based on all of the things that Jesus has said and done. Um, but then again, will I realistically think that Jesus would be the type of person to run a government? Not at all. But if he was advising the people in the government, I'm pretty sure that he would want them to spend that money in a different way. And that would lead to some kind. I don't think the problem, I'll be tempted to say that Jesus would not be a socialist. And it really comes to down to the government owning all the means of production. I think that's where I would draw the line, and I could not put that on Jesus. I couldn't say that Jesus would argue that the government should be the owner of all the contracts and all the businesses and control it from top down. I don't think he would probably be that kind of socialist. But when it comes to the redistribution of wealth to those people who need it to each their need, I think Jesus would be 100% on board with that.
so here's a curious question. Well, let's first off make sure we agree on a certain premise. So do we basically agree that Jesus and his general rhetoric and ideas are more about kind of moral pursuits than about pretty much anything else?
It's a tricky question, because when you talk about moral pursuits, I think, what is politics? what are people arguing about and debating over if it's not for what's the right thing to do? What's the best way to live in a society?
Well,
What values are worth protecting?
yeah,
And
well, we can come back to the government stuff, but like just kind of from a philosophical point, like can we not agree that the kind of Jesus's general rhetoric is much more focused on spiritual things and moral things than pretty much anything else? That's his general messaging.
I don't know. Just for the sake of moving forward, let's say yes, because I think Jesus focused on a lot of what we do here and now. But let's just say yes for the sake of going
So,
forward. And you may be right. I'm not saying you're not right, but for the sake of
yeah.
moving forward, let's say yes.
Okay. So then my second question would be, can a non-consensual action ever be an optimally moral action? There's something to think about.
Yes. You
How
see
so?
examples of that all throughout the Bible. God tells people to do things that they may not even want to do, and they have to do it because God told them to do it.
But are
For
they,
example, for
well,
example, go ahead, go ahead.
what's your example?
I was gonna say, for example, when God in the Bible told the Israelites to kill all the men, women, and children. And when the men came back to the camp, they had kept spoils and stuff that God told them to destroy and kill. And Moses got upset and told them that they needed to follow the commandments of God, regardless of what those soldiers wanted. But in their eyes, it was the morally right thing to do, regardless of what they actually wanted to do without their consent.
Okay. Yeah. I don't want to get too much into the Old Testament stuff, but I mean,
Nobody ever does.
no, but well, only for the purposes of this conversation, because mostly talking about Jesus. But
Well, I
again,
was just trying to give you
some
an example because the question you
sure.
asked me was, is it ever morally right to make somebody do something basically that they don't want to do? I'll just give you one example of, I would sure most Christians would agree that there are a lot of things they don't want to do, but they have to do it because it's the morally right thing to do.
Right. Well, my whole point, I guess, was like, isn't it always more moral for someone to perform that action voluntarily as opposed to, holding a gun to their head or sword or whatever, and then telling them they have to do it? Because
Yeah,
in reference to the action that is being performed by the person, right? Because like as soon as you like, hold a gun to my head or whatever and tell me I have to do something, then maybe the outcome is still good. It's very possible the outcome could be good. That doesn't mean the action that I'm taking is optimally moral from a personal.
yeah. I get the argument that you're making, which I would make the same argument when it comes to hell. I would say that hell is the gun to your head telling you if you don't live a certain way or believe a certain thing, these are the consequences if you don't do so. So I would think you would agree with me based on your argument just then, would you not?
Yeah, well, yeah, and again, this is a whole other hour or two conversation. But when it comes to some of those things, those like really like deeper questions about kind of the morality of the afterlife, and there's a lot of questions that involve some really tough thinking. And yeah, I would actually agree that the optimal, if you were asking me, which nobody cares, but but if you were asking me, the kind of the optimal afterlife situation really should involve at least three options instead of just two, assuming we're talking about kind of the biblical model, or at least the one that's generally agreed upon. The biblical model that's generally agreed upon by most people is that I think the optimal moral situation would be three options. You'd have kind of the general heaven option potentially, which is you come join with God, and maybe things are pretty good, but maybe you have to agree to certain things that these are the things that you agree upon, to go to heaven, and then then there's the hell situation where it's like you defy whatever God wants, and you get sent to hell, which is generally described as this kind of torturous, awful, basically the worst possible place you could think of. Then I think there really should be a third option, which is really what this planet, this earth, this life is, right? It's just a bunch of people that are thrown into this life who are allowed to make both good decisions and bad decisions completely freely, with free will, right? Because there is an argument to be made that there's no free will in heaven, and there's no free will in hell, at least in the full sense of the will to do good and the will to do bad. Because essentially the belief is there's no will to do bad in heaven, and there's no will to do good in hell, or at least there's certainly no ability to do. I'll take away the will.
We going off on a whole different territory.
Great.
Yeah. So I want to actually get into a part of the conversation we were having off camera was atheism, and I think you feel like atheism leads to Marxism.
Not necessarily. That might be a little bit of a misrepresentation. Like, I think a more accurate way of putting it would be that atheism is at risk of stepping foot into Marxism more so than most forms of theism. Certainly, any biblical forms of theism. That would be the best way I would state it.
All right, so let's get into that. I want to jump into that conversation on the Patreon section. I do appreciate you coming on. Tell people where they can find you or anything that you want to promote.
Yeah, obviously, you can find me on the social medias. Dallas Duff. I'm a musician working with. Now, don't judge. Don't judge my views based upon kind of what I'm about to promote. But I'm currently working with this. I'm a musician. I'm currently working with this band called the Highway Women. If you kind of like country stuff, it's got some pop elements as well. But I'm a guitar player and also songwriter involved in that group. So you can check them out. I also have a book called How to Win Every Debate as a Conservative. You can find that on a few different places, or you can just reach out to me directly if anybody's interested in a copy of that. So.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for coming on, man. And all of y'all, I hope y'all enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, you like politics, religion, and culture, go ahead, smash that subscribe button below. And we're moving on to the Patreon section. So if you would like to get in on the conversation, all you got to do is go to patreon.com/the Javier Javier Show. You know what it is. Make sure you spell it twice. All right, folks, we are out.
1 in a million to 1 villain. Too hot to be in the kitchen, out in the melting the ceiling.